Good evening. I'm Keith Cole, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Wolf River Conservancy. I want to welcome you here tonight to our virtual lecture on a very relevant topic, bringing back the Bobwhite, presented by Ellie Burken. Our presentation tonight is part of our ongoing educational outreach to the community. Kathy Justice, our Director of Education, facilitates tonight's lecture, as well as all of our community educational outreach throughout the year. We also want to acknowledge our presenting sponsors for tonight's lecture series. Our corporate sponsor is Buckman, and our foundation sponsor is the Crawford Howard Family Foundation. But we'd also like to take this time to acknowledge all of our 2022 corporate benefactors. They would include AutoZone, Brother International, FedEx, Hyde Family Foundation, International Paper, Jim Karras Subaru, Ring Container Technologies, and our newest is Silvamo. Thank you all corporate benefactors for your tremendous support. But again, we also want to acknowledge all of our supporters, both corporations or other organizations, individual donors, and volunteers. You all are critically important to the Wolf River Conservancy and allowing us to deliver on our mission throughout the year, and we appreciate you all. As always, you can visit wolfriver.org to learn more about other activities that we sponsor and to learn more about our work and mission in our community. Some housekeeping details for tonight. Please do not attempt to record tonight's lecture. We will be recording it, and if you've registered for tonight's program, you will receive a link in the next few days that will allow you to rewatch it or share it with others. During the evening, we ask you if you have questions to use the Q&A feature and not the chat box. Kathy Justice, our Director of Education, will be monitoring those questions, and at the end of the evening, she'll be presenting those to our presenter. So now I have the pleasure to introduce to you our presenter for this evening, Ellie Burken. Ellie is a University of Tennessee graduate student working under the direction of Drs. David Buehler and Craig Harper, and they are monitoring the quail population at the Wolf River Quail Focus Area in West Tennessee to better understand why quail populations are declining. Northern bobwhite quail populations have declined significantly across Tennessee and the rest of the range over the past 50 years. Ellie and her team are working with the TWRA, the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, and their managers to design and implement quail habitat improvements to address the factors limiting the population. Ellie is leading the field work and will be talking about the lessons learned from the work at the Wolf River Wildlife Management Area. Please help me welcome to our virtual stage tonight, Ellie Burken. Ellie, thank you for being here.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, perfect. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. Oops, So tonight, as he mentioned, I will be talking over the Tennessee Cooperative Northern Bobwhite Project going on within the state of Tennessee. And again, my advisors, both Dr. David Buehler and Dr. Craig Harper, are also helping me oversee this effort within the state. But I also wanted to give a shout out because it is not only the university that is putting effort into this project. Both TWRA has focused on funding a lot of our project, along with providing a lot of the groundwork to assist us in the field work and giving us support throughout the state. And Quail Forever has also been a major help with our project as well. So they have provided a lot of support also on the ground and within some of the specific nonprofit chapters that go on within the state. They also helped provide a lot of the funding and the push to get this project started. So to start today, to just give you an outline of what I'll go over in the presentation, I first thought I'd start off with the life history of the Northern Bobwhite and give you an idea of how the bird works in a whole, some of its reproductive strategies, and then I was going to dive into some of the population status currently for the Northern Bobwhite, which has already been mentioned is fairly low. And then I was going to go into some of the specific habitat management required for this bird, and then dive into my project and go over it in its entirety. So to start out with today, to give you a little bit of the morphology of the northern bobwhite, and to give you the sound of the call, the northern bobwhite is named as Clinius virginianus and belongs to the order Galliformes, which includes turkeys, pheasants, and other game bird species. It is one of 6 native quail species within the United States, but it is the most abundant of any of the 6 species. Sometimes its range does overlap with other birds, such as the scaled quail, as you can see here, or Gambel's quail, and some hybridization can go on, but that's fairly rare. The northern bobwhite, as you heard already, is named for its distinctive bobwhite call. So in the past, a lot of people used to remember this echoing across the farmland across the United States, but that call has lessened as the years have gone on. And Tennessee has decided that the northern bobwhite will be the state game bird of the state starting back in 1987. And not only is it the state game bird, it is also known as the Prince of Game Birds. So to dive a little bit into the distribution map of the northern bobwhite, it does cover over 30 states in the United States, and it does extend up into some parts of Canada and down into Mexico. The map you see here tonight is a population density map recorded off of count calls across the United States. So a lot of the darker red areas is where there's been more dense observations of bobwhites recorded. So within this map itself, you can see that in Tennessee, the western half of the state tends to have denser population counts than the eastern half. To go further on into the northern bobwhite, this is what a male northern bobwhite looks like. So it's known for its very distinctive black and white coloring around the face, especially with that distinct stripe right over its eye. And then the female northern bobwhite has a little bit of the duller colors with it. It has the more buffy, downy colors of yellow and gray right around the eyes. Here you can see that the head crest is a little puffed up. That does not differ between the female and the male. This is just the position that the female is in. So these birds are roughly 15 centimeters high and weigh only about 180 grams. So they're really small birds and fairly dense, and they can fly very short distances to flush away from predators. To continue talking about the life cycle of the northern bobwhite quail, starting in April, in the section that says covey breakup, it is when birds start to move out of their large social groups and start pairing off individually. So they start going into the breeding season, and hopefully some mating occurs, and then you head into the nesting season. So in the nesting season, bobwhites can begin nesting as soon as the later portions of April, and they can re-nest and continue to go all the way through the end of September. So northern bobwhites typically have anywhere from 10 to 15 eggs in their nest, but as they continue to go through the nesting season and have to relay or re-nest, that number of eggs lessens. Then after you hopefully have a nest hatched, you start brood rearing. And brood rearing can be done either by the males or the females in the population. So they're sort of unusual for a game bird species, as the males do help in some of the reproduction. And again, males don't only help brood, they can also help sit on the nests as well. And then hopefully as that brood continues to grow and develop, the birds will start coveying up. So a covey is defined as a group of northern bobwhites, and this can vary anywhere from 2 birds all the way up to over 30 birds. But typically within the state of Tennessee, you see birds probably within 8 to 15 bird groups. And then again, the life cycle will continue with these groups going throughout the wintertime to provide cover and warmth and assistance to one another until they get back to covey breakup and they start to go into the nesting season again. So for my first poll question tonight, I wanted to ask, what is the average lifespan of a northern bobwhite quail? So if Mike could put that up for me. Mike, are you able to put that question up?
It's Matt, sorry.
Matt, I'm so sorry, Matt.
Matt, are you out there?
Sorry. Does it help if I stop sharing my screen or?
No, he should be able to throw it right up there. I'm not sure what's happening. Just a sec, let me.
No, that's fine. Just let me know if you want me to continue and we can go on without it as well.
Matt, can you respond? There we go.
Oh, we had it for a moment. Perfect. Okay, these are interesting results to see. It seems 2 years seems to be the most common trend. So overall, the actual answer for when they most typically, let's see if I can get, when they typically die is right around 6 months. So the northern bobwhite, one of the most common phrases is that northern bobwhites are born to die. They typically don't survive very long in the wild. The max amount that a northern bobwhite could live in the wild would be 5 years, but that is very, very rarely seen. So that was a fun one to get you started, but we'll look into the habitat and how some of that affects their lifespan. So for northern bobwhite, a lot of what they need is defined as early successional habitat. So this refers to habitat that is in a recently disturbed stage and has a lot of the grass and forb component needed for northern bobwhites. So this frequent disturbance can happen and should happen on a regular interval. It should be disturbed every few years in order for those northern bobwhites to survive well. And they do absolutely need woody cover. So northern bobwhites are known as a shrub obligate. And so while most people think of them as grassland birds, the grass portion of their habitat is not nearly as important as the woody cover in here or some of the shrubland. So without that, birds do not have the necessary predator escape cover to avoid predators that might be chasing them, or to use some of this woody cover for thermal reasons as well. So in the wintertime, when it's really cold out, it's helpful to get under there and also to escape some of the sunshine and the heat during the summer months. Northern bobwhites use this as a thermal refuge. So to go into some of the rotational disturbance that northern bobwhites need for their habitat, again, this needs to be on a very regular return interval. So northern bobwhites need to be in a landscape that is disturbed in some method in an interval of every 1 to 4 years. Once you start getting out of that 4-year period, that habitat starts to become a little more dense than what they need. So the woody component can begin to be too much. And especially in a forested setting, northern bobwhites cannot live in a deciduous forest. So this disturbance is often done through 2 different methods, as you can see here in these photos. So a fire interval, as you see here on the right-hand side, is what was typically used across the landscape, both by past Native Americans within the southeastern range and also just by random intervals with lightning put down as a source. So returning that fire interval that the area used to see in the past is critical for northern bobwhite, along with disking, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, also provides that soil disturbance and helps redo some of the habitat on a regular basis. So northern bobwhite does have a very rich hunting history within the state. Within the state, it's often done, or not just within the state, across the southeast, northern bobwhite hunting is typically done with dogs, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner. These dogs have a lot of money put into their training and performance. So they're used to help go and locate northern bobwhites without the attempt to flush them typically. So the hunting resource of northern bobwhites was used for both state and a resource agency and rural income source. So a lot of the money that goes with northern bobwhite hunting, both with the Pittman-Robertson Act, does go with the sale of licenses, does go directly back towards the state to manage that wildlife source. And with the travel of finding more rural communities that provided good areas for bobwhite hunting, it also provided that travel income for those communities as well. But within the state of Tennessee, in 1980, there was roughly 80,000 hunters and they harvested over 2 million birds. But if you look at the year of 2021, there was less than 5,000 hunters and very, very few birds were harvested across the state. So this says a very large impact on what their population looks like today. So to get into that population decline, nationally across the United States, the northern bobwhite has declined starting in 1966. The first good recorded instance of northern bobwhite has recorded at a rate of 3.5% nationally. But within the state of Tennessee, it's decreased even more than that at a rate of 5.6% across the state. So the northern bobwhite decline was noted as far back as 1930 by Aldo Leopold, but the first good record with the breeding bird survey was recorded in 1966. So that goes into my next poll question is, what do you believe is the greatest cause responsible for the northern bobwhite population declines across the United States? So if Matt wants to put that one up, perfect. Well, you guys all did excellent on this one. So yes, the answer is truly habitat loss and fragmentation has been the greatest impact for the northern bobwhite population decline across the state. We can continue, there we go. So going into that a little bit more, so that loss of habitat, it comes from several different factors. So first off, what I was mentioning earlier about that early succession needed for northern bobwhites, when that habitat becomes more advanced, northern bobwhites can no longer use that area to the extent they did in the past. Other aspects of habitat loss have occurred with agricultural intensification. So in the past, agricultural areas used to be a lot smaller with family farms, and they had a lot of shrubby fence rows to provide some of that habitat necessary for northern bobwhites. But both the expansion of farms with greater acreage, less fence rows available, and with precision agriculture that has lessened a lot of those edges that bobwhites were able to use in the past. There's also been a lot of different silvicultural practices. So in the past, as many people were going across and using areas across the United States and settling, a lot of trees were being put down and allowing room for greater pasture land and agricultural land, and also just for the use of wood burning and whatnot as well. But as those practices have stopped, the forests have come back and become denser and denser as time goes on. So they form a closed canopy that does not provide good habitat for northern bobwhites. And there is the factor of urbanization. So as the world population continues to grow immensely, people continue to take up more and more land across the United States and eventually take away a lot of that habitat available to northern bobwhites. There is also some increased predation that has been seen, but this isn't directly linked to northern bobwhite population declines, but some predators have abundant in the years, such as Cooper's hawks and other forms of avian predators, which have also had a negative impact on northern bobwhite populations. So to go into some of the historical conservation methods that were used to help northern bobwhites, one of the most common ones used in early history, starting in the 1930s up until the 1960s, was the release of pen-reared birds. So a lot of people raise domestic quail and hoped to release these and boost the populations, but this is not a good option for northern bobwhites. Pen-reared birds rarely survive once they're released. If they last up to a year, that would be shocking. So northern bobwhites do not abund or rebound well with pen-reared birds. They also started planting exotic shrubby species starting in the 1960s. So these included species such as bicolor lespedeza, which is meant to hopefully form a shrubby fence row for birds to use. And they also put in other species such as Sericea lespedeza, as you can see here in the bottom corner, to help promote bobwhite food. But unfortunately, this was probably one of the worst plants ever used for northern bobwhite conservation. Sericea lespedeza, as you can see below, begins to carpet an environment and outcompetes a lot of other native species. So it has become very invasive across the state. And unfortunately, while it seemed like a good food source in the past, the nutritional content of Sericea lespedeza is very little. So even though northern bobwhites tend to gorge themselves on the seed, they're getting no nutritional capacity from eating that seed, so it harms them in the end. They are now focusing a lot more on the removal of non-native plants, so as Sericea lespedeza, along with a lot of other ones as well. And a lot of people have planned to restore native grasslands across the state of Tennessee and helping rejuvenate those areas back to what they were in the past. And there have been a lot of areas focusing on reintroducing those disturbance regimes I talked about earlier. But in today's world, both the removal of non-natives and the reintroduction of disturbance regimes are the biggest components that are still continuing on for today. So to go into my project and to describe exactly what we're hoping to accomplish, I'd like to go over our project objectives. So starting out, first off, we are looking to document a lot of the existing quail populations on each one of our study sites to get an idea of what the previous populations are and what level they're at. And then from there, we're also going into what exactly their reproductive status is of each of these populations, along with the overall survival of each of these birds, and looking a lot at the home range and movements of birds across each one of the areas. We're also looking into some of the habitat use of birds into different vegetation types and trying to get an idea of what habitat conditions are on each one of our focal areas. For our fourth objective, we have helped to develop comprehensive management plans for each one of our WMAs. So we're attempting to practice some finer scale habitat management plans in accordance with a lot of the WMA staff and trying to see if that makes a difference with any of our populations. And then overall, we're hoping to create a large population model for each one of these and looking at if any of these specific habitat management practices will have a large effect on both the survival and population of each one of the northern bobwhites on each site. So to go over how we picked our sites, first I have to describe what a quail focal area is. So to describe a quail focal area, in 2013, the state of Tennessee went through and selected 4 quail focal areas across the state. So each one of these focal areas is made up of a smaller anchor WMA. So this anchor has to be at least 1,000 acres minimum in order to provide a good base area for a quail population to flourish. But each one of these WMAs was selected in an area that has a larger quail focal area around it. So this is in the blue here, an area where northern bobwhites would be allowed to increase coming from that smaller anchor area. So for each one of these quail focal areas, the state did choose 4, which you can see here, but one of them, Kiker Bottoms WMA, which is one of my study sites, is technically considered a quail demonstration area. It's not large enough to meet that 1,000 acres minimum for that anchorage area, but again, it is still a quail focal area and is one of the best ones we have over in Region 4. We also study at Bridgestone Firestone WMA over in Region 3 up on the Cumberland Plateau. And then finally, as most of you know, we do look at Wolf River WMA over in Region 1. So to go into each one of the WMAs we're studying, for Kiker Bottoms WMA, it is roughly 576 acres, and it has a small portion of it that is used year-round for moist soil management for ducks and other waterfowl species. So these are permanently flooded units that aren't always available for quail use. There is always 350 acres used for upland management. So these acres are always available for quail, along with some of the other wetland units as they deplete their water resources in the summer. So this area is dominated really well by early succession and has a lot of that excellent forb and shrub cover that we're looking for within this area, which is nestled in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, but it does have some limitations to it, unfortunately. So with it being in a wetland area, it does have very productive soil, which helps increase that early succession at a faster rate than what might normally be seen at an upland area. So it is really hard to maintain that early succession. And again, there's really not a lot of manpower on the ground to fight some of that early succession as it continues on. To continue into Bridgestone WMA, Bridgestone Firestone, this area is roughly 700 acres of good quail habitat is the anchor point. So it is known as the farm unit, and it is an entirely open area with no forest within the farm unit itself. And so in the past, it was a livestock farm before it was donated to TWRA back in 1990s. And so this area does have a lot of blank canvas for us to go in and use it and to help support it for quail populations. But it does have some limitations as well. As this 700-acre block does sound relatively large, it is entirely surrounded by deciduous forest, which is not a suitable habitat for northern bobwhite quail. And then lastly, to go into Wolf River WMA, it is roughly 1,300 acres that are available for quail management. Some of those acres, about 950, are all open and considered early successional, but there is roughly 350 acres of some forested landscape within that area. To look at some of the attributes for Wolf River WMA, it is a very open landscape, and again has that good forb and shrub cover component already there for the WMA. But again, there is some limitations. So Wolf River WMA is adjacent to a swamp, and so fortunately that does allow for those moist soils and does make it hard to maintain that early succession. And there is about 200 acres of bottomland forest, so this is flooded timber that would be very hard to convert over for good quail habitat. So to also make note, Wolf River WMA is also designated as the National Bobwhite Grasslands Initiative area within the state. So to define what NBGI is, this is a nonprofit organization that occurs nationally. There is roughly 25 states involved in this organization, and it is focused on the restoration of northern bobwhites and their grassland habitat across the United States. So in order to be considered a NBGI focal area, it does have to have a minimum of 1,500 acres, which Wolf River does, and it has to have at least 25% of that acreage in that quail focal area. So that 25% would be very similar to the anchor area that I talked about earlier when describing the state's focal areas. There's also some other rules and regulations that go along with being an NBGI observation point. So these have regular covey counts that occur each year that can be reported as a national basis. And there's different habitat assessments that occur at different time intervals for this as well. So this is a different method of northern bobwhite habitat management, and it's just another group that's helping to promote the species conservation across the nation. So to talk about how our project started, in September of 2020, this project was officially approved by TWRA, and we started our groundwork right away in December of 2020. So that involved getting a lot of the supplies ready. And then in January of 2021, we started a lot of the training for each one of our technicians that is available on each one of our study sites. So after that training happened, we were able to begin trapping and tracking the birds that we locate on each study site. And we also went in and created those specific habitat management plans for each site as well. So in May is when our trapping efforts ended for that winter, and our project began to focus on a lot of the nesting and brood monitoring efforts that occur during that summer season. In June of 2021 is when I was officially brought onto the project to help oversee the field efforts and to get involved more than my advisors could be. So starting in July, really soon after I got here, we started doing a lot of the vegetation sampling across each one of the sites that we used to help evaluate habitat selection of our birds. And then in September of 2021, We were able to wrap that up, and starting in October, we began our fall trapping efforts, and then we also started doing some of the covey counts that we do across each one of our study sites as well. And then we also do not only summer vegetation sampling, we also do vegetation sampling throughout the winter season as well. And so we were able to do that starting in January and going throughout March. And then again in May of this year, we were able to finish our spring trapping efforts and continue on from there. So to go into how we actually capture each one of our birds. So in the upper right-hand corner, you can see an example of what our baited funnel traps look like. So it is essentially a wire cage that has a small pronged funnel on the inside. And when I say pronged, I mean it has sharp points on the point of the funnel. So as a bird wanders in, those sharp prongs will prevent birds from hopefully coming back out of that funnel. So each one of our baited traps has either birdseed, cracked corn, or milo used to bait each one of our birds in. And then here you can see that there's a large log placed on top. So this helps weigh down each of our traps, both so birds can't bust out of it and predators can't come in and easily flip the trap and get to our birds inside of it. With these traps, we would normally place them under shrubby cover or something a little more dense, and we would also lay a lot of branches on top to provide a little more of that thermal refuge for birds as well. And then the diagram down here in the middle is another form of trapping we've used across each one of our sites. So this is a baited interception trap. So each one of the boxes here represents that funnel trap that you see in the upper right-hand corner. And then with the long line in the middle, that is a fence of some sort. So we've used chicken wire most commonly. And so if we have an area that is small enough and that we think birds travel frequently, we'll put down a fence with boxes at the end. So hopefully an entire covey of birds might hit that fence and then wander into one of our traps. So it helps direct birds to our traps a bit more effectively, but this is hard to use if it's not a constricted bottleneck area. So from there, I wanted to actually show you some of the capture and workup of our birds. So starting here, you can see us start to pull birds out of the bag. I'll fast forward a little bit because it did take us a while to get out and to move back in front of the camera. So here you can see myself and one of my technicians. And so as we go on, you can see how gently I am holding the bird's head up. So this is a male that I have within my hands, and we're focusing on putting our collars around him. So our collars are VHF radio transmitters, and they rest right around the neck there and have an antenna that you can see popping out along the back. Right now, I'm placing a leg band on each one of our birds. So the leg band has a 3-digit number on it that helps us identify each one of the birds. So most of the time, the frequencies also, for our radio collars, each one has an associated frequency. Those are individual, but sometimes we reuse collars if they fall off a bird early on. So the leg band is our true identifier for what each bird is. Right here, you can see us cutting off the excess string, and we dabbed a little bit of super glue. And then now we continue to preen a lot of the feathers out and over the collar of the bird. So this takes a long time because we do use collars and not backpacks, which would rest along the back and wrap around the base of wings. The collars can fall off. So we spend a lot of time trying to get a lot of those feathers up and over each one of the collars to help hold it down. So we spend a lot of time trying to focus on getting as many feathers out as possible. The birds look a little ruffled up, but typically when we process each one of our birds, it takes us anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. The more you do it, the faster you get. But we spend a lot of time trying to trap our birds, but we do try to minimize the impact we have on each one of the animals. So we handle them for the shortest amount of time possible. So as we continue to go on and preen out each one of those feathers, you can't really see the harness that collar is, or that transmitter's on anymore. And in her hands right now, you can see a pillowcase. So that is what we use when we pull each one of the birds outside of the trap. Here, we're actually looking at each one of the wings. So that's how we're able to observe whether it is a juvenile, which is designated as less than 6 months, or an adult. So we can do this based off some of the tips that are seen on each one of the wings. And we're also able to go in and take some of the feather samples and look for ectoparasites, which also might be available under each one of the wings as well. So you can see that this bird's starting to get a little anxious and is ready to get out of hand. So there's not too much more, but to show you some of the actual release for each one of our birds. So I'll move this out of the way. So once we've actually finished handling each of our birds, you get to release them, which is always a fun process. So this was a female that we had. And most of the time, there's no issue with any of our release. We always try to get them to fly away, as it allows us to have a visual cue of how that bird is doing upon release. And I have one more video to show you of a release, just to give you another idea of a different habitat. So this is our East Tennessee site out at Kiker Bottom. So you can see some of the Smoky Mountain foothills in the background. So this is a very different environment. You can see some of the wetland units in the background as well, but our birds do really well around each one of these wetland units. So again, a good release, has a very good flight, and we're able to look and see where that bird goes and make sure it goes down safely. This is one of my favorite parts of trapping quail, is getting to work them up and watch the release and see how they do. So how we actually monitor our birds once we have trapped them. So with that VHF radio collar, we're able to track them with radio telemetry equipment. So for our birds, we track them a minimum of 3 times per week, and we use the homing method. And so the homing method allows us to get within 30 to 50 meters of those birds. So based on the signal and the strength of it, along with the direction in which we hear it, we're able to approach them and get this close to them. So 30 to 50 meters is designated for quail as a good space of, they won't flush at that point. And we hardly disturb a lot of their natural activities within this distance. And then once we've actually located the birds, we record the time of day at which we found them, so we can get an idea of what they're doing temporally throughout the day. And then we also estimate the vegetation type that they're using, along with trying to estimate the activity of what that bird might be doing. So some of the activities we're able to estimate would be nesting, brooding, flushing if you got that close to a bird, and we're also able to guesstimate the loafing activity of a bird and or the feeding activity of a bird. One of the other important things we do across each one of our study sites is fall covey counts. So as I mentioned earlier with the NBGI protocol, we do ours in accordance with their protocol. So each one of our study sites has a covey count occur at a minimum of 3 times per site. So each one of these counts starts 45 minutes before sunrise. And as observers are out in each one of their locations, as you can see here on the map, they estimate the number of coveys that they can hear calling, and they can also estimate the distance to those coveys along with the bearing or the direction that each one of those coveys is in. And as we record each time we hear a covey, we're also able to get an estimated calling rate for each of the birds out there. The one place where we do differ from the NBGI protocol is that we do a 15-minute playback starting at sunrise. So this playback is meant to help stimulate coveys that might not have been calling previously by supporting or supplementing a different kind of call in there. And then once we're done playing our playbacks, which is 5 minutes long, we go in and try to flush any of the available coveys there. And as we flush them, we try to get a count of how many birds are in each covey. So this is just a different method of estimating density across each one of our sites. And within each site, each one of our observation points is located with a radius of 350 meters. So this distance allows us to make sure that we are not missing any coveys and that we are overlapping a little bit with adjacent observers. So we're covering each one of our study areas to the best of our abilities. For as we head into the reproductive season, we start doing our nest monitoring. So we start conducting nest searches. So this happens after once the springtime hits and we get closer to breeding season, we increase our tracking of birds from 3 times a week to 5 times a week, because we're able to notice whether a bird is sitting in the same exact area after it's been there at least 2 days in a row. So once a bird has sat in the same exact area, and when I say same exact area, I mean the same 10 feet, because you're able to get that close to a bird, you're able to go in and assume that they have a nest there. So after we've assumed a bird has a nest, we continue to check on a daily basis until we think that bird might have moved out of the area. And then we can go in by hand and look for the nest itself. And so as we go on and continue monitoring this nest, we're able to decide its fate ultimately. So there's only 3 fates that we observe on our project, which is an abandoned nest where the adult moves off and we can't notice a good reason why, which very rarely happens. Most often, about 50% of the time, our nests are predated, and this tends to happen both by mammalian and reptilian predators. Or about 42% of the time, our nests do actually hatch. So we're able to go in and look at the way the eggshells are broken to determine whether it is predated or hatched. Hatched eggs often hatch right down the middle, and so we're able to get an idea of how many eggs actually hatched. And if any eggs did not hatch, we collect those and send them off to the UT vet school to determine if those eggs were viable in the first place. So if those nests did indeed hatch, we go in and we look at some of the brood monitoring of our birds. So this is actually a wild brood that we were able to catch and handle. But when we go in, we try to flush them on a 7-day basis. So as a nest has hatched, we either track that brood via the tagged hen, or sometimes it is the tagged male, and we flush them 7 days after hatching, and then 14 days, 21 days, and 28 days. So as we go in and flush, we try to count each of the chicks that we see, which often isn't always accurate, but it is our best method of a reproductive measure. So lastly, we also do habitat vegetation sampling. So starting in the summertime, we go in and we do as many samples as we can across each one of our sites. So when we sample, we actually go in and use those locations where we tracked birds to, and we're able to sample the exact location of where the birds were. And then we sample a random area as well. So we take a random distance and bearing, and we're able to look at exactly what the birds are selecting for within their habitat, and then seeing what they might not be selecting for in the random areas. So as we go in, we look at the different vegetation type of what that area might be, and we can go in and do a transect, as you see here with our tape laid out. We measure and identify the vegetation down to species at every meter for 30 meters. We also go in and look at the litter depth every 10 meters, along with getting a visual obstruction reading and seeing what the vertical structure of the habitat is. We also look at ground sighting distance, which gives us an idea of the openness at ground level. So when you think of a quail has to be able to adequately move throughout its habitat at about a 15 centimeter height. We also record other measurements, such as the nearest distance to woody cover in the description of that, along with man-made structures. And then we also go in and count all of the woody stems that might be present in an area to see how dense of an area for woodiness that a bird might use. And we also look at the overall basal area to get an idea of the tree composition in each one of our sites. And again, we also look in the winter time. So we also look at several different things in the winter. Unfortunately, we are not able to identify down to species or look through some of the ground sighting distance, but we can get an average vegetation height for some of the dead vegetation that is still here. And as you can see in the lower photos, some of the vegetation that birds use is very dense and can often be covered with blackberry thorns and a lot of other stuff. So sampling is always interesting to see where you'll end up. So to give you an idea of some of the project stats we've had so far, I will see if I can minimize that out of the way. So overall for each one of our sites, we've caught 226 birds, but we've only been able to collar roughly 206. When we go into collar each one of our birds, they have to have a minimum weight requirement. So if our birds are not over 130 grams, we don't collar them because we would worry that a transmitter might weigh them down and affect some of their flight patterns. We do have a fairly good success rate. So for our trap success rate, for each night a trap is open, this is the successfulness we've had. So while it looks a little low here, quail are a difficult species to catch and we spend a lot of time catching them. Our trapping season does go from October all the way until May. And again, thinking back to one of the original polls of what is the average lifespan of a northern bobwhite quail, it is only 6 months. So we often tag quail only for them to live a few months, and then we have to continue to replenish our study sample at each one of our sites. So it does take a lot of time and effort to accurately study northern bobwhites. For our recapture percentage, this represents of the amount of captures we've had for each one of our sites, what percent is actually just a bird continuing to go back in a trap. So unfortunately, sometimes when you catch a bird, it continues to use your trap over and over. So instead of getting new birds, you continue to get old birds. And for the number of locations on here, altogether, we have just under 8,000 locations. So these are each one of the telemetry locations and the amount of times we've been able to track birds in different areas. So here's a map actually of Wolf River. So this gets to showcase some of the telemetry locations we've found across the site. So this occurs in the non-breeding season, which would be considered the winter season for northern bobwhites. So you can see that the northern bobwhites here are using a lot smaller of an area, but then once you look at the summer locations, as those birds begin to split off into their pairs, they tend to spread across and use a lot more of the WMA. So down in the lower left-hand corner, the WMA boundary actually ends along one of the roads there. So in the bottom left-hand corner, some of our birds do take off to adjacent private land once breeding season occurs and are able to use some of the other different agricultural land adjacent to the WMA. So lastly, I wanted to discuss some of the habitat enhancement plans that we have created for each one of our WMAs. So earlier I talked about some of that rotational disturbance that is needed for each one of the WMAs. So we have prescribed, in accordance with a lot of our WMA managers, an accurate treatment of each one of the areas. And we've also tried to fine-tune a lot of our management to a very small scale. So the typical home range for a northern bobwhite quail is anywhere from 40 to 50 acres. And so in the upper portion of this photo here, you're able to see each one of these yellow units, which represents a, early successional habitat. So each one of these units is broken up into smaller compartments. So each one of the compartments is roughly anywhere from 5 to 15 acres. And so as we go along and do some of that rotational disturbance, we like to go in and do only a smaller compartment within each unit to disturb that. So if you were to go in and completely do disturbance to roughly a 40 to 60 acre unit, you might bump that northern bobwhite out of its entire home range and put it in an unfamiliar area, which would make it more vulnerable to predation and other issues with survival. So we try to go in and disturb each one of these units and intersperse those across the WMA. So you're only disturbing a small portion of a bobwhite's home range instead of disturbing the entirety of it. Some of the other management regimes we're focusing on for each one of our WMAs is, again, the removal of a lot of the non-native species that are causing issues across each one of the sites. We're also looking to remove or thin a lot of the native warm season grasses that are available on each one of the sites. Native warm season grasses such as big blue stem, switchgrass, or Indian grass can become very thick and clumping across the WMA and tend to shade out other good forb species that are needed for northern bobwhite quail. And in some of our study sites, we are lacking some of that woody cover that I've mentioned is so essential for quail conservation. So in some of these areas, we're hoping to both encourage that woody cover and in some cases plant some of it as well. So to touch on some of our habitat management plans, specifically one that's gone out at Wolf River, what you're looking at in a map here in the striped yellow area is where Wolf River used to have a dove field as of 2021. So Starting in January, you can see a lot of the bird locations we've had for each of the birds in the year of 2021, and how they weren't able to use this dove field, which was planted in dense corn. But as of our prescription, we decided to move the dove field to a different part of the WMA and let that field go fallow. So this field is not being managed anymore for corn, but still has standing corn stalks in it, along with other forb or weed species that have been available. And you can see here in the red of year 2022 that our birds immediately used that area once that management regime stopped here. So this is a good method to come in and see exactly how northern bobwhite can adapt to different habitat conditions and how quickly that can occur across each one of our study sites. So we also are looking to take our project in some future directions. So we are hoping to look at the thermal impacts of bobwhite habitat. This is looking specifically at some of the vegetation types that northern bobwhites use, and a lot of the vegetation and what heat might be associated with it. So as I was talking about the woody cover, a lot of bobwhites use that as thermal cover. So we're hoping to get an idea of, what thermal refuge that might provide for each of our birds. And we're also looking to implement a predator index across each one of our study sites with a camera grid. So we're hoping to set up a systematic grid and put out camera traps mainly for mammalian predators to get an idea of the abundance of each species and what their impact on northern bobwhite might be. So that was the overall gist of what we're looking at with the project. I do have some acknowledgements to give out for both my advisors, Dr. David Bueller and Dr. Craig Harper. They have been a huge help with getting this project started. I've had a lot of technicians that have helped me in making this project work as smoothly as possible. But again, the TWRA staff has been very, very helpful. I mean, we could not do this project without the assistance of TWRA. Out at Wolf River, the manager, Brandon Gilbert, has been essential in assisting with our project along with his technician, Tony Duncan. I do have some lab mates back here at UT that have been helpful in getting our project up and off the ground and assisting with whatever I need. And again, Quail Forever, in particular, the Smoky Mountain chapter that's located out here near the Smoky Mountains, has been essential, and this project would not have been started without them. And we also have some very dedicated volunteers that come out and spend many hours searching for coveys with us with a lot of their bird dogs. So Jim McGrady has been very essential in having that happen. And so to sum it up, does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much, Ellie. And I have a couple of questions here for you.
Yes, of course.
From our viewers. First is there any information about quail populations in the 1700s or 1800s?
Yes, so for specific population numbers, we only have estimates back there. So again, starting in 1966 was the best method of population observance. So that started with the Breeding Bird Survey. But back in the 17 and 1800s, quail populations were abundant across the United States. They did have that natural disturb regime with fire that I'd mentioned. And so again, with that, along with the small family farms, a lot of that landscape helped to promote quail populations. And that would be the typical time period in which you would hear people reference to as a lot of the good old days of when quail were abundant across the United States, and many, many, many hundreds of people use them both as a resource, both for income and for food source as well.
Okay, that's great. All right, next question. Why has TWRA not fostered a campaign against clean farming, quote unquote, and the use of Bermuda and fescue, which are anti-game grasses? Also, why did the Wolf River WMA change from a small game WMA to an all game area concentrating on deer and turkey?
So the state is currently going through right now to reevaluate some of the quail focal areas. The idea of a quail focal area is to have quail as the primary species of conservation for that site. But at the same time, each one of the WMAs, including Wolf River, is hoping to promote other species conservation as well on it. So sometimes there is a little bit of a handoff between focusing solely on conservation for quail. Again, it is good to have the support of deer and turkey hunters as well, particularly as they, at the moment, are able to bring in more money with license sales than quail hunters are across the state. In regards to what TWRA does, I can't speak fully for them as I'm only with the university, but they do a lot of work with private lands and working to help some of those pasture and agricultural systems with anybody that wants to work with CRP easements and things like that to help promote northern bobwhite's habitat success. So they can do some of that with the planting of native species or just helping to promote, again, that rotational disturbance that we described earlier, as a lot of those native species are still present in the seed bank, even, 60 years past when they were early successional habitat. So the state does do a lot of work with private land, but we're able to have full focus on the public land that we work on. So that's how we're focusing our project efforts right now.
Okay. And related to that question, here's another one. In general, are adjacent landowners to TWRA managed lands cooperative in managing for bobwhites?
Yes, they are. I think in some areas, though, private lands conservation can be a very difficult realm to get into. It is always difficult to come up with a management plan that a landowner would like and be willing to get involved with for a significant time period to help support those quail conservation areas. So when this started back in 2013, the focus on the quail focal areas across the state, there has been a lot of effort with the private lands adjacent to it, but that has been a much slower process than the habitat management going on each one of the WMAs. So private lands work is essential in helping us to allow for more acreage for northern bobwhite to exist, but we're still figuring out better ways to come up with it and manage that.
I'll follow up on that question. So if a landowner is interested in promoting bobwhites on their property, what would be their best resources?
So there's several different resources that you're able to go to for that. There is private land biologists for each region of Tennessee. So there's 4 regions. So each area has its own private lands biologist that would be willing to work with landowners and come out. But you're also able to go through Quail Forever. That is a nonprofit organization that has a lot of people on the ground. Currently, I think they have at least, or they're going to have at 14 staff members at the end of this year. I think currently they have 8 staff members scattered throughout the state of Tennessee. So they're able to come out and work with your private lands as well. So looking up any of those contacts within the state would be beneficial. Those would be the best routes to go for getting landowners involved with quail conservation.
All right, thank you. Here's a question, just wondering about Ames Plantation and what's going on there with quail.
So Ames Plantation in the past, especially in the 80s and 90s, was a large area that was used for quail research. There hasn't been much research going on from that point up until now, specifically with quail. Currently, Ames Research does a lot of the field trials for quail. So they run a lot of national bird dog trials there and are able to look into, the best efforts of bird dogs across the nation. They do a lot of releasing of pen-reared birds there, specifically for bird trials. But currently, to my knowledge, there's not anything going on specifically with quail. I believe they've had some studies looking a little more into the CWD of deer in that area at that point right now. So yeah, not anything currently, I don't think, with quail.
That's very interesting. I have a question. You were talking about the importance of woody cover, and I was wondering if you could just give us a few species. I was just something that interested me.
Yeah, so for quail cover, a lot of the times across some of the WMAs, some of the most common things you'll see would be a form of sumac, whether it's smooth or winged sumac. You can also get into other good species. A lot of young saplings would provide good thickets as well. Most often, woody cover is not to be confused with blackberry or brambles. If you think about trying to, dive into one of those areas, it doesn't really work for you to get through it, much less a bobwhite trying to get in that area as well. But you also have plum thickets would be a really good reference. Again, a lot of those sapling efforts as well are excellent woody cover.
How about red mulberry? Would that be one?
That would be good in its youth stage. That one does grow up to be a full tree, but quail don't need only grasslands. They can use savannas as well, which have a very low basal area in it that only has, roughly 30% tree coverage. And they also use woodland areas as well, which would have roughly 40% canopy cover tree coverage. So just had elderberry is also a very popular species used for woody cover.
Yeah, that one seems great.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Finally, on the there's one comment I'll give at the very end, but do you suggest any books for people interested in quail, maybe for a general reader, or maybe you don't know?
That one's off the top of my head. The quail is astounding. You can go all the way back to Aldo Leopold if you're looking to the some of the first good references for quail across the state. There's a lot of good researchers. I'm looking at one on my desk right now. It's the Bobwhite Quail by Walter Rosine is a really good base evaluation of quail across the state or across the nation. But I don't have any other good recommendations right off the top of my head.
Okay, and then following up on that, what are ways that people beyond private landowners, what are ways they can help quail? Bobwhites.
Ways they can help quail. So for quail conservation, I think across a lot of the United States, I think it is really important to always promote some of the basic educational and coverage needs of quail. I think sometimes they've been a species that fades into the background. But for quail, I think more than anything else, promoting what they need for habitat is the most important factor. A lot of people think of removing predators or providing feed for quail, which are good methods of conservation, but the population of a quail does depend on its most base level on the quality of its habitat. So we always need to improve both the quality and quantity of habitat. So if there's anything locally going on with quail in the area you guys are in, or in different adjacent states, make sure to get out and be heard about quail conservation. I think that would be the best thing to do. There's some quail conservation practices that do go against what other forms of conservation. For quail, they don't need trees, so we like to see a little bit more of cutting trees. So promoting some of that stuff in areas that might not enjoy that would also be a good method of conservation.
And I'll also suggest perhaps just supporting groups which work for quail conservation. That's also
yes. Whether it's local conservation groups, some of the Quail Forever, each one tends to have a nonprofit chapter in different regions of the state. So if you don't have a local chapter nearby, you can look into methods of getting one started and connecting with some of the professional Quail Forever folk in the area. They'd love to help see those go and promote with any of the fundraising and conservation that might need to happen.
Okay. Let's see, a few more questions or comments at least came in. I've got one, someone says she has 92 acres, 27 of them open. I guess, how does that sound for quail?
92 acres is a really good starting place for supporting a sustaining quail conservation area. Some of that area might need to be a little bit bigger than that if you were to provide space for more than one covey. But that would be an excellent base level to start out and, see if any neighbors are interested as well to, make sure that landscape is as large as possible. But again, reaching out to some of those Quail Forever or private land biologists within the state of Tennessee, they'd be able to help you and come out pretty much immediately to come up with a good conservation plan for you.
Okay. Someone has written in that Quail Forever biologists may be found at quailforever.org. Thank you for that. And here's another question. Bush hog half, last time about 40 feet wide, then will disc. Alternate yearly the 40-foot cutting. August or September bush hog, is this reasonable?
I personally wouldn't recommend bush hogging in August and September. Personally, quail are still going through the second portion of their nesting season at that point in time. So there is always the possibility that you are affecting that breeding season. And again, young broods, broods cannot flush until they are 2 weeks of age. So even the avoidance of possibly getting some broods as well would also be an issue. So I wouldn't suggest that time frame for bush hogging.
Okay, that's very helpful. Does the Forest Service help with this effort? I guess meaning Bobwhite conservation.
Regarding the Forest Service, I haven't had much interaction with them. I've only had a little interaction with the Tennessee Division of Forestry as well. They do help in some regards with providing some of the equipment to remove trees. They are interested in, helping you get those off. And there is, some money to be made in the removal of trees as well. So you can reach out to them with help with getting areas like that cut and managed for quail in that method.
Okay, and I think our last comment, it's more like a command, is beat Florida.
Yeah, exactly. Florida is a really good state for quail conservation. Tall timbers has been going on for a long time, but we would love to see Tennessee, get to that extent and beyond. We would love to see that.
Yeah, I think that they might be talking about football, but
yeah. That too. I'm a quail mindset.
That's right. You got the big orange shirt on there. So.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Well, that was just a fantastic talk. And everyone, I hope that I got your questions answered. Let me check real quick, make sure. Oh, here we go. Here's a comment from Ryan, my colleague Ryan here at Wolf River Conservancy, which says that Wolf River Conservancy supports quail management and protection of their habitat through our land conservation activities and real estate additions to the Wolf River WMA. So yes, we are doing our part. We're also doing a little bit of habitat restoration up on the Ghost River State Natural Area, which we hope that someday that will attract some quail. So we will see.
Yes. No.
So Ellie, thank you very much. This was just wonderful. I hope everyone enjoyed it who joined us tonight. And I'll let you go get you some dinner or whatever.
Sounds good. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk and discuss my research today. It's always a joy to get to do it with people.
Okay, thank you so much and good luck with your research.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Bye-bye.
Bye.